Repeater offers us various ways to present the responses to our requests. These range from hex output all the way up to a fully rendered version of the page. I would say that more often than not, it is not able to actually fully render it from my experience, but then again, maybe they've made improvements in the latest iterations of Burp Suite, and I don't know about that because I do not use render a lot, and I also don't use the inbuilt browser. So we have 4 display options here. Let me fire up Burp Suite and maybe start not the attack box, so temporary project, use defaults, start Burp. We have a private window here, all good to go. The only thing that I need to do is to actually start or connect to their VPN. Let's see, I could start the machine as well in case we need it. So we are at views. We have the pretty, this is the default option. Let me also just connect to their VPN as well. Go back here. Where is it? So THM, let's connect. We're connected to their VPN, going back here. So pretty 34 seconds. We've got the IP address in 30 seconds, 29. Regardless, we have the pretty view, which is the default option. It takes the raw response and attempts to beautify it slightly, making it easier to read. This is really interesting when you are dealing with JSON files or JSON responses, because it actually makes the JSON response really readable, so to speak. You have the raw response, which is the unbeautified response from the server. This is actually really useful when you want to be extremely specific in actually copying or understanding something from the response, or maybe in a request copy something or modify the request very, very specifically. So the machine is started. Let's just copy this and then test to see if it says bad gateway. Interesting. Why would we have a bad gateway? Are we not connected to their VPN? Let's see. We've got the basic usage. Let's refresh. We still have a bad gateway. Not anymore. All right, back. We have this hex view, which takes the raw response and gives us a byte view of it, especially useful if the response is a binary file. Yes. Render. The render view renders the page as it would appear in your browser. Well, it's not hugely useful, given that we would usually be interested in the source code when using Repeater. This is still a neat trick. So I would say that I use it maybe 5% of the times. In most instances, the pretty option is perfectly adequate. However, it is still well worth knowing how to use the other 3 options. Right on point, I completely agree. Just to the right of the views button is the show non-printable characters, which is this one. This button allows us to display, so let's actually be more practical. Clear this, clear history, yes. Then let's refresh this, go into the repeater, and we can see everything in here. We don't have a prettify view of the request here because there's nothing to prettify. If this would be a post request and you'd have stuff to be sent in the body of the request as JSON, you might have seen a pretty version or the pretty being enabled here, but this is not the case. Now we do have a pretty response, which is by default. We could also look at the raw response, the hex response, and the render response, which in this case renders, I would say, perfectly at a first glance. Alright, going back. For example, every line in the response will end with the character RN. These signify a carriage return and a new line character and are part of the HTTP header. Headers, they are part of how the HTTP headers are interpreted. Whilst not required, the option can still come in handy. So experiment with the available options, which is what I've just shown you. Which view option displays the response in the same format as your browser? The render, but I wouldn't say exactly the same. Sometimes there might be differences because this is not a full built-in browser, or the render does not mimic the full experience of the browser. Alright, so we have the views. Now the inspector. In many ways, inspector is entirely supplementary, which is why I would say that I mostly use it never. To the request and responses fields of the repeater window. If you understand how to read and edit HTTP requests, then you might find that you rarely use inspector at all, which is why I don't. That said, it is a superb way to get a prettified breakdown of the request responses, as well as for experimenting to see how changes made using the higher level inspector affect the equivalent raw versions. So we have the inspector, which is minimized here. You have the request attributes. In this case, you have, so it actually helps you understand how it works. You have the HTTP one and HTTP. It's interesting. So since I mostly never use it, I'm finding new things about it. You can modify the version of the HTTP protocol. Is this actually those that are available? I'll have to experiment with it. So you have the get, you have the request attributes. In this case, our method is get and our path is the root. Then, so if I click on something, doesn't actually change it. Request query parameters, it's empty in here because we do not have other parameters in the query, because there would be request query parameters if I would say index.php page equals 1, and then you'd see request query parameters page equals 1. Interesting. So I could probably increment this or decrement it, or whatever way I would be able to manipulate it. Request body parameters, we have none because there are no request body parameters in the get request. Maybe if this would be a put, a patch, a post request. Request cookies, there are no cookies, but if I would say cookie UID or ses_id equals this, it would actually populate it in here. Request headers and response headers. In this case, if we have a response, we have the response headers. If this would have been, so if I send this to the repeater with control R, we do not have any response headers until we actually send the request, and then we have the response headers as well. So things to keep in mind about the inspector gadget. So inspector can be used in the proxy as well as the repeater tab. In both cases it appears over, so you also have it in the proxy here in the HTTP history. Inspector is present and to the duty. Of these, the request section can nearly always be altered. Yes, that's the magic of Burp, allowing us to add, edit, and delete items. For example, in the request attributes section, we can edit the parts of the request that deal with location, method, and protocol, which is what we've seen. The other sections is the ones that I've told you about. These components can all be found as text within the request and response sections. However, it can be nice to see them in the tabular format offered by the inspector. It's well worth adding, removing, and editing headers in Inspector to get a feel of how the raw version changes as you do so. Sweet. Alright. Shall we do task number 6 in this video? Maybe. Let's see how many minutes we are in. 10 minutes. Let's do it. Repeater is best suited for the kind of task where we need to send the same request numerous times, usually with small changes in between requests. For example, we may wish to manually test for a SQLi, attempt to bypass a web application firewall, or simply add or change parameters in a form submission. Let's just start with using Repeater to alter the headers we sent to a target. So capture a request to this. Did we? We did not. So let's do it right now. They say capture, which does not actually mean intercept, which is why I do not intercept on. I just like to leave it off. So we've intercepted this. We send it to the repeater. Move it closer to the proxy, which is what I like to do. Capture a request and send it to the repeater. Send the request once from repeater. Send the request once from repeater. So I should send it. You should see the HTML source code for the page you requested in the response tab. Try viewing this in one of the other options, such as the render one. So in this case, if we look at the render, we can see our Bastion hosting. Alright. Using inspector or manually if we prefer, add a header called flag authorized and send it to have a value of true. So in this case, we just add one. Let's add it just here, flag authorized to true, and then send a request. There seems to be nothing in here, but if we look at the prettier version, maybe there's nothing in here either. Let's see, THM flag authorized, set it a value to true with capital T. So now we have 6802 bytes. Notice this. Let's see what happens if we change it. We have 210 bytes. So if we just add this header, we're actually being given a different response, which is interesting. Interesting to note that changing one header can completely change the response. So going back here, we should say this and then submit. Alright. Extra mile SQLi with repeater. Heck, let's actually do this. This test contains an extra mile challenge, which means that it is slightly harder. Maybe that should be the subject of another video. I don't know. If you feel comfortable performing a manual SQL injection, you may skip the last question and try this as a blind challenge. Otherwise, a guide will be given below. Before we start, if you don't already know the principles of SQLi, do look into the video, do look into the playlist where this video is on. There is an entire section of maybe 10 videos on SQL injection, so you should actually check them out if you do not know nothing about them. Full steps will be provided, so you do not need in-depth knowledge. The brief. There is a union SQL injection in the ID parameter of about ID endpoint. So we capture this thing here. Let's try and do it quickly. And then it says that we have send that to the repeater. So prepare the terrain. Once you have captured the request, which is what we did, now that we have our request primed, let's confirm that a vulnerability exists. Where should we add the apostrophe? We add the apostrophe here, and then we should get a SQL error. Send it. Where's the SQL error? Invalid statement. Select first last name. So we have the SQL error. What else? 500 internal. Yeah, so we have a 500 internal status, HTTP status code response. We did that. We've seen that. Now this is extremely useful error message. The message tells us a couple of things. The query is selecting 5 columns, so we have first name, let's go back in here, first name, last name, PF, role, bio, from people, where ID equals 2. So we're giving a lot of hints here. You should never ever have such verbose error messages in your application. This is advice, or this is suggestion for someone who's in the blue camp. Okay, with this information we can skip over the query, column number, and table enumeration steps. Therefore we can just construct our SQL like this. So we have select column name null 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 for so we know that we have 5 columns. We just need the column name, and the rest are going to be null from information schema columns where table is people. Now in this situation we're going to receive the column name, which is where is the column name? Should be here somewhere. ID none. ID none none. Is that what we're looking for? Yeah, about ID none. Where's the about? You have ID none, none, none. Regardless, looking through the return responses, we can see that the first column name is ID, which has been inserted into the page title. Alright, yeah, so it's in the title. Completed. We have successfully pulled the first column, but we have a problem. The page is only displaying the first matching item. We need to see all of them. So group concat is what we're gonna use, so we can amalgamate. That's an interesting word. All of the column names into a single output. So let's just amalgamate everything in there. Nice word, amalgamate. So we have first name, last name, and everything in here. So what we're going to actually do now is to pull information from those columns. Our target column is notes. So union all select nodes from people where ID equals 1. So this would be the first one. Let's do with ID equals 2. What if we go back to 1 so we can see about none? This is what we're looking for though. So this is the node we're looking for. Hey presto, we have a flag. And the flag is this. Exactly. So room conclusion. We now have completed this room. You should hopefully understand how to use repeater to edit, manipulate, and resend. It was a nice combination with the SQL injection thing, as well as having an idea about the many practical applications for this. The next room in the module, and what we're going to start in the next video, is the intruder tool. So that being said, this video should be completed in 19 minutes.